41 minutes. That is how long the window was. From 1:47 in the morning when the first camera at Nancy Guthrie's home went dark, to 2:28 when her pacemaker application disconnected from her phone. 41 minutes during which someone systematically disabled the surveillance systems at her property, during which someone was detected moving through her home, during which something happened that left physical evidence at the scene that would change everything investigators thought they knew about this case. And here is what the public was not told in those first critical hours, what took days to emerge through carefully worded press conferences and leaked reports, what the evidence at the scene revealed to the first responders who walked through that door on the afternoon of February 1st, 2026. This was never a kidnapping for ransom. This was something else entirely, something darker, something that investigators recognized within minutes of processing that scene, but that they could not say publicly because saying it would compromise the investigation and potentially endanger Nancy Guthrie if there was any chance she was still alive. The sheriff knew. The moment deputies walked into that home and saw what was there, the moment they documented the physical evidence, the moment they processed the scene and understood what the timeline and the forensics were telling them, they knew. This was not a case of someone taking Nancy to hold her for money. This was a case of something violent happening inside that house, something that left evidence that could not be explained by a simple abduction, something that required homicide investigators to be brought in immediately, even though no body had been found. And then the ransom notes started arriving. Notes sent to media organizations demanding millions of dollars. Notes that contained details that seemed credible. Notes that created a public narrative of a kidnapping for financial gain. But here is what those notes actually were. They were either part of an elaborate misdirection by someone who knew that creating the appearance of a kidnapping would buy time and shift investigative focus, or they were opportunistic frauds by people who saw a high-profile disappearance and decided to exploit it. And investigators, reading those notes while standing in a home that told a very different story, had to navigate the gap between what the public believed was happening and what the evidence suggested had actually occurred. This is the story of the 41 minutes that changed everything. This is the story of what the evidence at Nancy Guthrie's home actually showed, why homicide investigators were called in from the very beginning, and why the ransom narrative that dominated headlines for days may have been the biggest misdirection in this entire case. If you want to understand what really happened, if you want to look past the headlines and examine what the physical evidence and the investigative decisions actually tell us about this case, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to True Crime Vault right now and hit that notification bell because we are about to go deep into the forensics, the timeline, and the investigative strategy that the public never fully understood. Hit that like button as well. It helps this kind of in-depth analysis reach the people who want to understand cases at this level. Now let us break this down piece by piece. When Pima County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home at 12:15 in the afternoon on February 1st, 2026, they were responding to a missing persons report. An elderly woman had not appeared at church that morning. Her family had gone to her home to check on her and found her missing. That is how the call came in, a welfare check that became a missing persons case. Standard procedure in a situation like this would be to document the scene, interview the family members who discovered the absence, begin establishing a timeline of when the person was last seen, gather information about their mental and physical condition, determine whether they had means of transportation, check for any signs of planning or preparation for a trip, and make an initial assessment of whether the disappearance appeared voluntary or involuntary. Missing persons cases are tragically common. Thousands of people are reported missing in the United States every year. The vast majority of those cases resolve within hours or days. People turn up. They were visiting a friend and forgot to mention it. They had a medical episode and ended up in a hospital. They got confused and wandered. They made a spontaneous decision to go somewhere without telling anyone. The initial response to a missing persons report is typically measured, professional, and focused on gathering information rather than assuming the worst. But within a very short period of time after arriving at Nancy Guthrie's residence, something changed. The response shifted from routine missing persons protocol to something much more urgent and much more serious. The scene was secured. Crime scene tape went up. Additional units were called. Homicide investigators were summoned. The FBI was notified. And the home began to be processed, not as the last known location of a missing person, but as an active crime scene where something significant had occurred. That shift happened fast. Too fast for it to have been a routine escalation based on standard missing persons protocols. Too fast for it to have been a decision made after hours of investigation and deliberation. Something at that scene, something visible and documentable and significant enough to change the entire character of the response, told the first officers who walked through that door that this was not a case of an elderly woman wandering off or taking an unplanned trip. This was something else. Something that required a completely different investigative approach. Sheriff Chris Nanos would later describe the conditions inside the home as very concerning. He would say that what was observed was inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. He would state publicly that investigators believed Nancy had been taken from her home against her will, and crucially, in language that anyone paying close attention should have recognized as deeply significant, he would say that homicide investigators had been brought into the case because evidence at the scene indicated a crime had occurred inside the residence. Let us stop right there and think very carefully about what that language actually means, because the choice of words in official statements from law enforcement is never accidental. Every word is chosen, every phrase is vetted, every statement is calibrated to communicate what can be said publicly without compromising the investigation or revealing details that need to remain confidential. Homicide investigators are not called to missing person scenes as a matter of routine. They are not called because someone is elderly or because they have been gone for a few hours or because the family is concerned. They are called when there is evidence suggesting that a death has occurred or that violence consistent with a potential homicide has taken place. The decision to bring in homicide investigators is a significant one. It reflects a determination by the initial responding officers and their supervisors that what they are looking at goes beyond a disappearance and crosses into the territory of a violent crime. It reflects a professional judgment made by people with extensive experience in these situations that the evidence at the scene requires expertise in death investigation, in violent crime reconstruction, in the kind of forensic analysis that homicide cases demand. What did they see? What evidence was present at that scene, visible within the first hour or two of the initial response, that led to that determination? What was so concerning, so inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance, so clearly indicative of a crime having occurred, that it justified the immediate escalation to a homicide investigation, even though no body had been found, and even though the official public position was that Nancy had been taken and might still be alive? The public would learn some of it in the days that followed, though even what was released publicly was carefully limited and strategically timed. Bloodstains were found at or near the entrance of the home. That detail was confirmed publicly after DNA testing established that the blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. The doorbell camera had been physically removed from its mounting, not simply disabled but actually taken from the property. Nancy's personal belongings, including her phone, her medication, her keys, everything she would need if she were leaving voluntarily, were still in the home exactly where she would have left them. And the overall conditions at the scene, conditions that have not been fully described publicly, but that were significant enough to drive the entire investigative response, told a story that was deeply inconsistent with Nancy simply being missing. Blood evidence at a scene tells investigators an enormous amount of information, far more than the general public typically understands. The location of blood tells you where an event occurred. The amount of blood gives you information about the severity of whatever caused the bleeding. The pattern of blood, whether it is drops or smears or transfer or impact spatter, tells you about the mechanism of injury and the dynamics of what happened. The distribution of blood across surfaces tells you about movement, about whether a person was stationary or moving, about whether there was a struggle or whether the event was more controlled. When investigators see blood evidence at the scene of a reported disappearance, particularly when that blood is confirmed through DNA testing to belong to the missing person, it fundamentally changes the investigative picture. Because blood in your home when you are missing is not consistent with you having left voluntarily. Blood at the entrance of your home is not consistent with you having packed a bag and walked out under your own power. Blood that requires forensic processing and DNA confirmation is not consistent with a minor injury or an accident that you then left to seek treatment for. Blood evidence, especially blood evidence significant enough to be noted and documented and tested, is evidence of trauma. Evidence that something happened to cause injury. evidence that needs to be understood in the context of what else the scene is showing. In Nancy's case, the blood was at or near the entrance of her home. Think about what that location tells you. The entrance is where people come and go. It is where someone arriving at the property would first encounter a resident. It is where a confrontation might occur if someone entered the home uninvited. It is where evidence of an event at the threshold between inside and outside would be deposited. Blood at that location, combined with a missing resident and a physically removed security camera, paints a picture that investigators would have been able to read immediately. The doorbell camera removal is another critical piece of evidence that tells us something specific about intent and planning. Modern doorbell cameras are designed to be somewhat tamper-resistant. They are mounted securely. They require tools or significant force to remove. They are placed in visible locations specifically because their visibility is part of their deterrent value. The fact that Nancy's doorbell camera was not just disabled but physically removed from the property tells investigators several things simultaneously. First, it tells them that someone was at that property who knew the camera was there and who made the decision that it needed to be taken. Second, it tells them that the person who took it either had the tools and knowledge to remove it properly or was willing to use force to remove it improperly. Third, it tells them that the person who took it believed that taking the physical device was necessary, presumably because they were concerned about what the device might have recorded. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, it tells them that the removal happened at a time when the person doing the removing had the time and the freedom to work on the camera without being observed or interrupted. You do not remove a doorbell camera in 30 seconds. You do not remove it while someone is watching. You remove it when you have control of the situation, when you are not worried about being interrupted, when you have the time to deal with the mounting hardware and the wiring and the physical extraction of the device. The fact that someone had that time, had that control, had that freedom to work on removing the camera, tells investigators something about the timeline of what happened and about the condition Nancy must have been in during the period when the camera was being removed. The personal belongings left behind are another category of evidence that shaped the investigative response. When someone leaves their home voluntarily, they take things with them. They take their phone because that is how they communicate, how they navigate, how they access information. They take their medication if they rely on daily medication for a chronic condition. They take their keys because that is how they get back in. They take their wallet or purse because that is how they pay for things. The absence of any of these items in a missing persons case is a red flag. The absence of all of them is a clear indication that the person did not leave under their own power with any kind of plan or intention. Nancy's phone was in the home. Her medication was in the home. Everything she would have needed to function independently for any period of time was still there. That is not consistent with her having decided to go somewhere. That is consistent with her having been taken, removed from her home by someone else, without the opportunity to gather her belongings or prepare for an absence of any duration. And then there are the conditions at the scene that have not been described publicly in detail, but that Sheriff Nanos characterized as very concerning and inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. What does that language cover? What did responding officers see that they have chosen not to share with the public? In homicide investigations, there are often details that are held back deliberately, either because releasing them would compromise the investigation, or because they are too sensitive or disturbing to share without a compelling reason. The fact that some details have been held back tells us that there are aspects of what was found at Nancy's home that investigators believe are significant enough to protect. It tells us that the full picture of what that scene showed is more detailed, more informative, and potentially more disturbing than what has been shared publicly. And it tells us that the decision about what to share and what to withhold was made carefully, with consideration for both the investigative needs and the dignity of Nancy and her family. The timeline that investigators released publicly on February 5th provides additional layers of context that are critical to understanding what they knew and when they knew it. Nancy was dropped off at her home by her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni at 9:48 in the evening on January 31st. The garage door closed at 9:50. Those facts are documented by security systems and are not in dispute. And then for approximately 4 hours, as far as the available evidence suggests, nothing happened. Nancy was home. The house was quiet. The cameras were functioning. The systems were operating normally. And then at 1:47 in the morning, the first camera went offline. That moment, 1:47 a.m., is not a random time. It is not a time when ordinary residential activity typically occurs. It is not a time when someone would be arriving home from work or leaving for an early shift or receiving a legitimate visitor. It is the deep middle of the night. It is when the world is dark and quiet, and when anyone moving through a residential neighborhood would be highly visible to anyone watching. It is when someone who does not want to be seen, who does not want to be remembered, who does not want witnesses, would choose to act. And what happened in the window between 1:47 and 2:28 is a sequence of events that investigators have reconstructed through digital forensics, through analysis of the security systems, through examination of the physical evidence, and through the kind of painstaking timeline development that is standard in complex criminal investigations. At 1:47, the doorbell camera disconnected. We now know from the FBI footage released on February 11th that it disconnected because someone physically approached it and tampered with it. Someone who was wearing a mask that covered their face, someone who was wearing gloves that covered their hands, someone who was carrying a backpack on their back, someone who was carrying a gun. That person approached the camera and did something to it that caused it to cease functioning at exactly 1:47 in the morning. At 2:12 in the morning, 25 minutes later, another camera somewhere else on the property detected movement. The motion sensor activated. The system registered that something was present in its field of view, but no video was recorded, or no video was available for investigators to review. Something had been done to compromise that camera's recording capability while leaving its motion detection active, or the configuration of the event was such that detection occurred without usable footage being captured. At 2:28 in the morning, 16 minutes after the second camera detected movement, and 41 minutes after the first camera went offline, Nancy's pacemaker application disconnected from her phone. That is the full sequence as it has been reported publicly. 3 distinct technological events, each documented with precise timestamps, each telling part of the story of what happened during that 41-minute window. And when you sit with those 3 events and think about what they mean individually and what they mean collectively, a picture emerges that is deeply troubling. The first camera going offline means someone was at the property and was taking action to disable surveillance. The second camera detecting movement means that person was moving through or around the property in a way that triggered the motion sensor. The pacemaker app disconnecting means that Nancy's phone, which had been in her possession and in proximity to her pacemaker, either moved out of range of the device, was turned off, or experienced some other disruption that severed the connection. 41 minutes. From the first camera going dark to the pacemaker app losing connection. 41 minutes during which someone moved through Nancy Guthrie's property, disabled her surveillance systems, and did something that resulted in her phone's connection to her medical device being severed. 41 minutes that contain the answer to what happened to Nancy, but that are documented only in fragments, in the digital breadcrumbs left by security systems and medical monitoring applications, in the footage recovered by the FBI from back-end servers, and in the physical evidence left at the scene that investigators processed on the afternoon of February 1st. Now let us talk in detail about what a kidnapping for ransom typically looks like, because understanding the pattern and the profile of these crimes is essential to understanding why the evidence in Nancy's case does not fit that pattern and why investigators would have recognized that disconnect almost immediately. Kidnapping for ransom is, at its core, a financially motivated crime. The perpetrator's goal is to extract money from the victim's family or associates. The victim is valuable specifically because they can be exchanged for that money. The ideal scenario from a kidnapper's perspective is a clean abduction with minimal violence, minimal evidence, and minimal risk of injury to the victim. The victim needs to be kept alive and in reasonable health because a dead victim or a seriously injured victim has no exchange value. In a well-planned kidnapping for ransom, you would expect to see several characteristics. The abduction itself would be designed to minimize confrontation. Surprise, overwhelming force applied quickly to establish control. Immediate removal from the scene before witnesses can observe or intervene. The goal is to take the person and leave with them as cleanly as possible, leaving behind minimal evidence and minimal indication of violence. The holding location would be secure, isolated, and provisioned for an extended stay. Kidnappers who are serious about exchanging the victim for money need to be able to keep that victim alive and reasonably healthy for however long the negotiation process takes. That means food, water, basic sanitation, medical attention if needed. It means a location where the victim can be held without neighbors hearing or seeing anything suspicious. It means planning for the duration. The communication with the family would be structured, controlled, and designed to establish credibility while managing risk. Kidnappers need to prove they have the victim, typically through photos, videos, or having the victim speak directly to family members. They need to make demands that are realistic enough that the family believes they can be met. They need to establish a channel for negotiation that does not expose them to immediate law enforcement action. And they need to create a plan for receiving payment and releasing the victim that minimizes their risk of being caught. Violence in a kidnapping for ransom scenario is counterproductive to all of these goals. If you injure the victim during the abduction, you create medical complications that make holding them more difficult and more risky. You create evidence at the scene that can be used to identify you or to establish what happened. You reduce the victim's ability to survive captivity, which reduces your ability to negotiate effectively. You increase the emotional desperation of the family, which can make them less predictable and potentially more likely to involve law enforcement aggressively rather than comply with demands. If you injure the victim seriously enough that they require medical attention, you now have a much more complicated situation to manage. You either have to provide that medical attention yourself, which requires knowledge and resources you may not have, or you have to take them to someone who can provide it, which exposes you to additional witnesses and additional risk. Or you have to accept that the victim may not survive, which defeats the entire purpose of the kidnapping. So, in a rational, well-planned kidnapping for ransom, violence is minimized. Control is established through surprise and overwhelming numbers, or through the display of weapons rather than through their use. The victim is taken in a condition that allows them to be transported safely and held securely. And the evidence left at the scene reflects that kind of controlled, planned operation rather than a chaotic struggle or a violent confrontation. What was found at Nancy Guthrie's home does not fit that pattern, at all, in any way. The blood evidence does not fit that pattern. Blood at the entrance of the home, blood significant enough to be documented and tested and confirmed through DNA analysis, is not consistent with a clean, controlled abduction. It is consistent with trauma, with injury, with something that happened at that location that caused bleeding. The immediate involvement of homicide investigators does not fit the pattern of a kidnapping for ransom. Homicide investigators are not called to scenes where the evidence suggests a clean, non-violent abduction. They are called when the evidence suggests violence that may have resulted in death or serious bodily harm. The language used by Sheriff Nanos in his early press conferences does not fit the pattern. His statement that evidence indicated a crime had occurred inside the residence is not language you use for a simple abduction. That is language you use when the scene tells a story of violence, of a criminal act that occurred within the walls of that home. The fact that the family was told, or allowed to believe, that paying the ransom might bring Nancy home safely does not tell us what investigators actually believed based on the evidence. It tells us that investigators were managing the family's expectations and emotions in a way that kept them hopeful and cooperative while the investigation proceeded. Because hope is what families need to function in situations like this. Hope is what keeps them engaged with the process. And taking away that hope before you have definitive proof that it is false serves no purpose and causes harm that cannot be undone. What fits the evidence at Nancy's home is something very different from a kidnapping for ransom. What fits the evidence is a scenario where violence occurred, where something went wrong during the event, or where violence was part of the plan from the beginning, where the condition in which Nancy left that home, if she left it alive at all, was not consistent with someone being taken to be held safely for ransom negotiations, but was consistent with something much more urgent, much more desperate, and much more troubling. And investigators, standing in that home on the afternoon of February 1st, looking at the blood evidence, seeing where it was located and how much of it there was, processing the missing camera and the abandoned phone and the medication left behind, and all the other details that have been held back from public disclosure, would have known this. They would have known within the first serious hour of scene processing that the narrative of a clean kidnapping for ransom was not supported by what they were seeing. They would have known that whatever happened in that house in the early hours of that morning was something that required homicide expertise to investigate. They would have known that the likelihood of Nancy being held safely somewhere while negotiations proceeded was not consistent with the evidence at the scene. But they could not say that publicly. Not yet. Not when there was even the smallest possibility, the remotest chance, that Nancy was still alive and that saying the wrong thing publicly might endanger her further or might compromise the investigation in ways that would make finding her harder or make building a case against whoever was responsible more difficult. So instead, the public messaging was carefully, deliberately, strategically calibrated. Nancy was taken against her will. That is true based on the evidence. The home was being treated as a crime scene. That is true and necessary given what was found there. Homicide investigators were involved. That is true and telling for anyone who understands what that involvement means. Evidence indicated a crime had occurred inside the residence. That is true and significant. All of these statements were factually accurate. All of them could be said publicly without revealing the full extent of what investigators knew or suspected. And all of them left room, however narrow that room might have been in the minds of the investigators processing the evidence, for the possibility that Nancy might still be alive and that the investigation might still result in her safe recovery. That is the gap that investigators had to navigate. The gap between what the evidence suggested and what the family needed to believe. The gap between what could be said publicly and what was known privately. The gap between the hope that Nancy was alive and being held for ransom and the forensic reality that suggested something much darker had occurred in her home during those 41 minutes. The ransom notes began arriving on February 2nd, the day after Nancy was reported missing, the day after investigators had spent hours processing her home as a crime scene, the day after homicide investigators had been brought in to examine evidence that was inconsistent with a simple disappearance. And this is where the investigation became extraordinarily complex, and where the gap between public narrative and investigative reality became most pronounced. The existence of ransom notes creates a public expectation that this is fundamentally a kidnapping for financial gain. It creates a narrative that the media runs with because kidnapping for ransom is a story the public understands, a crime with clear motivations and clear stakes and clear paths to resolution. It creates a framework that the family can grasp onto, a situation where there is something they can do, where paying money can potentially bring their loved one home. It shapes how the case is understood by everyone who is not inside the investigative process. But investigators looking at those ransom notes while also looking at the scene at Nancy's home, while processing the blood evidence and the timeline and the physical conditions that they had documented, would have been asking very different questions from what the public was asking. They would have been asking whether the notes were authentic communications from someone who actually had Nancy, or whether they were opportunistic frauds from people who saw a high-profile case and decided to exploit it. They would have been asking whether the notes were part of a misdirection strategy, designed to buy time and shift investigative focus away from what the physical evidence at the scene suggested had happened. They would have been asking whether someone who did something violent at Nancy's house sent those notes afterward as a way of creating an alternative explanation for her disappearance that did not involve acknowledging what had actually occurred. They would have been asking whether the details in the notes, the specific information about Nancy's home and what she was wearing, came from someone who was holding her, or from someone who had been present at the scene that night and who knew those details firsthand because they were there when whatever happened happened. Because specificity in a ransom note can come from multiple sources. It can come from ongoing contact with a living victim, or it can come from having been at the scene of a crime and knowing the details because you were the one who committed it. The first note arrived at Cold TV, a local CBS affiliate. The station reported receiving a letter demanding payment for Nancy's release. The note contained specific details about her home and about what she was wearing the night she disappeared. Law enforcement reviewed the note and took it seriously enough to ask the station not to publicly disclose its full contents. That request tells us that investigators believed there was information in the note that needed to be protected, either because it was genuinely probative or because releasing it would interfere with the investigation. But taking a note seriously enough to ask that its contents not be disclosed is not the same as believing the note is genuine. It is recognizing that the note contains information that needs to be managed carefully regardless of its source. It is understanding that in a high-profile case, information management is critical, and that releasing details prematurely can compromise investigative avenues or create additional complications. TMZ subsequently reported receiving a note demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin, with a specific cryptocurrency wallet address and a payment deadline. The specificity of that demand, the inclusion of the wallet address and the deadline, gave the note a veneer of credibility. It sounded professional. It sounded like someone who had thought through the mechanics of how to receive payment and who was creating a structure for the transaction. But again, specificity does not equal authenticity. Anyone who has researched cryptocurrency, anyone who has access to the internet and basic knowledge of how these transactions work, can create a wallet address and include it in a note. The existence of those details tells you that whoever sent the note had some level of technological literacy. It does not tell you that they actually had Nancy or that they were the ones responsible for her disappearance. Harvey Levin of TMZ later reported receiving additional communications, ones that claimed Nancy was still alive, that she was frightened, that she was aware of the demands being made. He emphasized repeatedly that he and his staff were uncertain about the validity of what he had received. That uncertainty is important because it reflects the reality that in high-profile cases, distinguishing genuine communications from fraudulent ones is extraordinarily difficult without additional evidence. The Pima County Sheriff's Department acknowledged publicly that it was aware of reports concerning the ransom notes and stated that all materials and tips were being forwarded to detectives working in coordination with the FBI. That is the appropriate public response. It commits to nothing. It confirms that the information is being taken seriously and processed through proper channels. And it avoids the trap of either validating or dismissing the notes publicly before the investigation has determined their actual provenance and significance. And then on February 5th, something happened that dramatically illustrated the problem investigators were facing. A man from California was arrested on federal charges. The allegation was that he had falsely posed as an abductor and had attempted to extort money from the Guthrie family. Authorities were explicit that this scheme appeared to be entirely unrelated to the other ransom communications that had received significant public attention. Think about what that arrest confirms. It confirms that there were people out there, people with no connection to Nancy's disappearance and no knowledge of what had actually happened to her, who saw the national media coverage and saw the fact that this involved a prominent family and decided that there was an opportunity to make money by pretending to be the kidnapper. It confirms that the high-profile nature of this case was attracting predatory individuals who were willing to exploit a family's anguish for personal financial gain. And it confirms that investigators had to evaluate every communication, every note, every claim, with the understanding that some significant percentage of them were going to be fraudulent, that they were going to be sent by people who had no actual information about Nancy's whereabouts, but who were hoping to capitalize on the family's desperation. If one person was willing to send a fake ransom note and attempt to extort the family, how many others might have done the same? How many of the communications that reached media organizations or that reached the family directly were genuine versus how many were opportunistic frauds? Investigators had to answer that question for each communication individually. They had to pursue each potential lead. They had to determine which notes, if any, were actually from someone who had Nancy or who had information about what happened to her. But the entire time they were doing that evaluation, the entire time they were processing ransom notes and tracking down fraudulent communications and interviewing people who claimed to have information, they were also working with the physical evidence from Nancy's home. Evidence that told a story that was fundamentally different from what the ransom notes were suggesting. Evidence that pointed toward violence rather than toward a clean abduction. Evidence that suggested whatever happened in that house during those 41 minutes was not consistent with Nancy being taken to be held safely while financial negotiations proceeded. And the gap between those two narratives, between what the notes said was happening and what the evidence at the scene indicated had happened, was something that investigators had to navigate every single day. They had to engage with the ransom narrative publicly because doing so kept communication channels open and maintained the possibility, however remote, that someone who actually had information might come forward. They had to support the family's belief that paying the ransom might bring Nancy home because that belief was what kept the family functional and cooperative. But privately, they were building a case based on the forensic evidence, based on what the scene had shown them on February 1st, based on what the blood in the cameras and the timeline told them about what had actually occurred. The involvement of the FBI from February 2nd onward is significant in ways that are worth examining in detail, because the FBI's role in this investigation tells us something about how seriously it was being taken and what resources were being brought to bear. The FBI has jurisdiction over kidnapping cases that cross state lines or that involve certain federal interests. They have resources that local law enforcement agencies often do not have access to. They have specialized units with expertise in kidnapping investigations, in ransom negotiations, in the kind of complex financial transactions that modern kidnappings involving cryptocurrency can require. They have laboratories with capabilities beyond what most local or even state crime labs can provide. They have intelligence assets and databases and analytical tools that can be brought to bear on investigations that meet certain criteria. Their involvement in the Nancy Guthrie case from the very early stages could be read as straightforward support for a kidnapping investigation. The geographic proximity of Tucson to the Mexican border meant that the possibility of Nancy being moved across that border had to be considered, and cross-border investigations fall within federal jurisdiction. The ransom notes mentioning cryptocurrency created a federal nexus that would justify FBI involvement. The profile of the case, involving a family member of a nationally prominent journalist, meant that federal resources were appropriate and available. But the FBI also has extensive expertise in violent crimes, in crime scene reconstruction, in forensic analysis of the kind that homicide cases require. Their involvement from the very early stages of this case could equally be read as recognition that this was a complex investigation with significant forensic challenges that would benefit from federal resources, regardless of whether the working theory was kidnapping, homicide, or something that fell into a gray area between the two. The fact that FBI forensic specialists were able to recover footage from Nancy's Google Nest camera, footage that should not have been available given that she did not have an active cloud storage subscription, demonstrates the level of technical capability that was being applied to this case. That recovery required accessing back-end systems, working with Google's engineering teams, potentially using legal process to compel disclosure of data that would not normally be accessible, and then analyzing that data to extract usable footage. That is not routine work. That is highly specialized digital forensics performed by people with expertise in exactly this kind of recovery. And the fact that it was successful, that footage was actually recovered showing a masked individual approaching Nancy's home, demonstrates both the sophistication of the investigative response and the priority that was being placed on developing every possible piece of evidence in this case. The public messaging throughout the first 10 days of the investigation maintained consistent language about abduction and about Nancy being taken against her will. Sheriff Nanos was consistent in his statements that investigators believed she had been taken from her home. He was consistent in describing her as vulnerable due to her age and her mobility limitations. He was consistent in stating that the scene was inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. But he was also consistent in stating that the home was a crime scene, that evidence indicated a crime had occurred inside the residence, and that homicide investigators were involved in processing that evidence. That dual framing, Nancy was taken, but also the home is a crime scene requiring homicide investigators, is not contradictory if you understand what it actually means. It means that investigators believed Nancy did not leave her home voluntarily. That much is clear from the evidence. It also means that investigators believed a violent crime occurred inside that home before or during her removal from it. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, and the language that allows both of those things to be communicated without explicitly stating that investigators believe Nancy was likely seriously injured or killed during the event is the language that Sheriff Nanos used consistently throughout those first critical days. Savannah Guthrie's public statements during this period provide some insight into what the family was being told and what they believed, though we have to be careful about reading too much into those statements because families in crisis are not always given complete information and are often told things in ways that preserve hope, even when that hope may not be fully supported by the evidence. On February 7th, Savannah released a video in which she said, speaking directly to whoever was responsible for her mother's disappearance, that the family had received the message and that they would pay. That statement reflects a family that was engaging with the ransom narrative, that believed or wanted to believe that paying money could result in Nancy's return, that was doing everything they could to create the conditions for that return to happen. On February 10th, Savannah said publicly that the family believed Nancy was still alive and that they were working toward bringing her home. That belief, that public statement of belief, is important because it tells us that either the family had not been told the full extent of what the evidence at the scene suggested, or they had been told but had chosen to maintain hope and to communicate that hope publicly as a way of keeping the possibility of Nancy's return alive. Families in situations like this need hope. They need to believe that their actions matter, that what they do can affect the outcome, that their loved one can still be saved. Taking away that hope, telling them definitively that the evidence suggests their loved one is likely deceased, is a decision that investigators make very carefully, and only when the evidence is overwhelming and unambiguous enough that maintaining hope serves no investigative purpose and causes more harm than acknowledging reality. It is possible that the Guthrie family, through February 10th, had not been told explicitly that the evidence at the scene suggested Nancy had been seriously injured. It is possible that they had been told but had chosen to maintain public hope as a strategy for keeping communication channels open with whoever might have taken Nancy. It is possible that they had access to information that the public did not have, information that supported the belief that Nancy might still be alive despite what the scene suggested. What we can say with certainty is that the family's public statements reflected hope, engagement with the ransom process, and a belief that Nancy could be brought home safely if the right actions were taken, and that those statements existed alongside an investigation that, from the first day, had treated Nancy's home as a crime scene and had involved homicide investigators in processing evidence that suggested something violent had occurred there. The February 11th release of the FBI footage was the first time the public got visual confirmation of what investigators had known since they successfully recovered the camera data. Someone came to Nancy's house in the middle of the night, someone wearing a mask that concealed their face, someone wearing gloves that prevented fingerprints, someone carrying a backpack that could contain tools, restraints, or other materials, someone carrying a gun that could be used to threaten or to harm. The footage shows that person approaching the camera. It shows them reaching the doorbell camera at 1:47 in the morning, the exact moment when the camera went offline according to the timeline. It shows them tampering with the device in a way that caused it to cease recording. What it does not show, what cannot be seen because the camera was disabled, is what happened next. What happened after the camera went dark? What happened in the 30-plus minutes between 1:47 and 2:28? What happened that left blood evidence at the entrance of Nancy's home and that caused her pacemaker app to disconnect from her phone? That is the gap. The gap between what the footage shows and what the evidence at the scene suggests happened after the footage ends. That gap is where the truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie exists. And that gap is what investigators have been working to fill through forensic analysis, through timeline reconstruction, through the careful examination of every piece of physical and digital evidence available. The detention and release of Carlos Palazuelos on February 10th added another data point to the public understanding of where the investigation was headed. A man was detained during a traffic stop south of Tucson. His home in Rio Rico, a community approximately 15 miles from the Mexican border, was searched under a court-authorized warrant. He was questioned for several hours, and then he was released without being charged. What does that sequence tell us? It tells us that investigators had developed a lead that they believed was substantial enough to justify seeking a search warrant. It tells us that a judge reviewed the evidence and determined that there was probable cause to believe that the location to be searched contained evidence relevant to the investigation. It tells us that investigators brought the person in for questioning and held them while they evaluated what they had. And it tells us that at the end of that process, they did not have enough evidence to file criminal charges. That could mean many things, and we have to be careful about speculating beyond what the facts actually support. It could mean that the person was not involved, and that investigators determined that through the questioning and through whatever was found or not found during the search. It could mean that the person was involved, but that the evidence to prove that involvement to the standard required for criminal charges was not yet sufficient. It could mean that the investigation is still developing and that decisions about charges will be made later as additional evidence is gathered and analyzed. What it definitely tells us is that the investigation was active, that leads were being pursued aggressively, that law enforcement was willing to take significant action based on the evidence they had developed, and that the process of determining who was responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie was ongoing and had not yet reached a conclusion that justified criminal charges against any specific individual. Now let us return to the central question that this entire analysis has been building toward. If this was never really a kidnapping for ransom, if the evidence at the scene told investigators from the very beginning that something violent had occurred inside Nancy's home, if homicide investigators were brought in on day one because what was found there required their expertise, Why maintain the public narrative of an abduction? Why engage with the ransom notes? Why allow the family to publicly state their willingness to pay millions of dollars? Why not simply acknowledge that the evidence suggested something darker and that the investigation was proceeding accordingly? The answer is both strategic and humane, and it reflects the complex reality of how major investigations are actually conducted when there is uncertainty about whether a victim is alive or deceased. Strategically, if there was any possibility, however remote based on the evidence, that Nancy was alive and being held somewhere, maintaining the appearance of engagement with ransom demands could buy time. It could keep whoever had Nancy from making a decision to end the situation in a way that would eliminate any chance of recovering her alive. It could keep communication channels open that might eventually lead to information about her location. It could create opportunities for the person or people responsible to make contact or to make mistakes that would reveal their identity or whereabouts. If you publicly announce that the evidence suggests the victim is deceased, you eliminate any reason for someone holding that victim to keep them alive. You eliminate any incentive for them to negotiate or to reach out. You potentially trigger a decision to dispose of evidence, to flee, or to take other actions that make the investigation and any potential prosecution more difficult. So even when the evidence strongly suggests that a victim is likely deceased, investigators will often maintain public ambiguity about that assessment as long as there is any investigative value in doing so. Humanely, and this is perhaps even more important, the family needed to believe they could do something. They needed to be able to take action, to engage with the process, to feel like they were fighting for Nancy. Taking away that hope by telling them explicitly and definitively that the evidence suggested Nancy had been seriously injured or killed during the event at her home would have been devastating in a way that served no purpose as long as there was any uncertainty, any possibility, however slim, that she might still be alive. Families process trauma in different ways and at different speeds. Some families want to know everything immediately, want full transparency about what the evidence shows regardless of how painful that information is. Other families need hope to function, need to believe that their loved one can be saved, need to be protected from information that would destroy their ability to continue participating in the search and the investigation. Law enforcement has to make judgments about how to communicate with families, about how much to share and when to share it, about how to balance transparency with compassion. And in a case where the evidence is concerning but not definitive, where there is physical evidence of violence but no body has been found, where the timeline and the forensics suggest something serious occurred, but the full picture is not yet clear, maintaining hope for the family while investigators continue their work is often the most humane approach. So investigators walked a line, a careful, deliberate, strategic line between the evidence and the hope, between what the scene showed and what the family needed to believe, between the forensic reality of blood and cameras and 41 minutes and the public narrative of kidnapping and ransom and the possibility of safe return. They processed the evidence with the seriousness and the expertise that a potential homicide requires. They brought in the specialists. They documented everything. They ran the forensic tests. They built the timeline. They pursued every lead. They treated Nancy's home as what the evidence suggested it was, which was the scene of a violent crime. But publicly, they maintained language that left room for hope, that allowed the ransom narrative to exist, that supported the family's belief that Nancy might still be alive and that paying the demanded money might bring her home. They did this not because they believed the ransom notes were genuine, though they had to evaluate that possibility, and not because they thought the evidence supported a scenario where Nancy was being held safely somewhere, though they could not completely rule that out. They did it because maintaining that narrative served investigative purposes, and because it was the most compassionate approach to a family living through unimaginable uncertainty. The footage shows that person approaching the camera. It shows them reaching the doorbell camera at 1:47 in the morning, the exact moment when the camera went offline according to the timeline. It shows them tampering with the device in a way that caused it to cease recording. What it does not show, what cannot be seen because the camera was disabled, is what happened next. What happened after the camera went dark? What happened in the 30-plus minutes between 1:47 and 2:28? What happened that left blood evidence at the entrance of Nancy's home and that caused her pacemaker app to disconnect from her phone? That is the gap. The gap between what the footage shows and what the evidence at the scene suggests happened after the footage ends. That gap is where the truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie exists. And that gap is what investigators have been working to fill through forensic analysis, through timeline reconstruction, through the careful examination of every piece of physical and digital evidence available. The detention and release of Carlos Palazuelos on February 10th added another data point to the public understanding of where the investigation was headed. A man was detained during a traffic stop south of Tucson. His home in Rio Rico, a community approximately 15 miles from the Mexican border, was searched under a court-authorized warrant. He was questioned for several hours, and then he was released without being charged. What does that sequence tell us? It tells us that investigators had developed a lead that they believed was substantial enough to justify seeking a search warrant. It tells us that a judge reviewed the evidence and determined that there was probable cause to believe that the location to be searched contained evidence relevant to the investigation. It tells us that investigators brought the person in for questioning and held them while they evaluated what they had. And it tells us that at the end of that process, they did not have enough evidence to file criminal charges. That could mean many things, and we have to be careful about speculating beyond what the facts actually support. It could mean that the person was not involved, and that investigators determined that, through the questioning and through whatever was found or not found during the search. It could mean that the person was involved, but that the evidence to prove that involvement to the standard required for criminal charges was not yet sufficient. It could mean that the investigation is still developing, and that decisions about charges will be made later as additional evidence is gathered and analyzed. What it definitely tells us is that the investigation was active, that leads were being pursued aggressively, that law enforcement was willing to take significant action based on the evidence they had developed, and that the process of determining who was responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie was ongoing and had not yet reached a conclusion that justified criminal charges against any specific individual. Now let us return to the central question that this entire analysis has been building toward. If this was never really a kidnapping for ransom, if the evidence at the scene told investigators from the very beginning that something violent had occurred inside Nancy's home, if homicide investigators were brought in on day one because what was found there required their expertise, why maintain the public narrative of an abduction? Why engage with the ransom notes? Why allow the family to publicly state their willingness to pay millions of dollars? Why not simply acknowledge that the evidence suggested something darker and that the investigation was proceeding accordingly? The answer is both strategic and humane, and it reflects the complex reality of how major investigations are actually conducted when there is uncertainty about whether a victim is alive or deceased. Strategically, if there was any possibility, however remote based on the evidence, that Nancy was alive and being held somewhere, maintaining the appearance of engagement with ransom demands could buy time. It could keep whoever had Nancy from making a decision to end the situation in a way that would eliminate any chance of recovering her alive. It could keep communication channels open that might eventually lead to information about her location. It could create opportunities for the person or people responsible to make contact or to make mistakes that would reveal their identity or whereabouts. If you publicly announce that the evidence suggests the victim is deceased, you eliminate any reason for someone holding that victim to keep them alive. You eliminate any incentive for them to negotiate or to reach out. You potentially trigger a decision to dispose of evidence, to flee, or to take other actions that make the investigation and any potential prosecution more difficult. So, even when the evidence strongly suggests that a victim is likely deceased, investigators will often maintain public ambiguity about that assessment, as long as there is any investigative value in doing so. Humanely, and this is perhaps even more important, the family needed to believe they could do something. They needed to be able to take action, to engage with the process, to feel like they were fighting for Nancy. Taking away that hope by telling them explicitly and definitively that the evidence suggested Nancy had been seriously injured or killed during the event at her home would have been devastating in a way that served no purpose as long as there was any uncertainty, any possibility, however slim, that she might still be alive. Families process trauma in different ways and at different speeds. Some families want to know everything immediately, want full transparency about what the evidence shows regardless of how painful that information is. Other families need hope to function, need to believe that their loved one can be saved, need to be protected from information that would destroy their ability to continue participating in the search and the investigation. Law enforcement has to make judgments about how to communicate with families, about how much to share and when to share it, about how to balance transparency with compassion. And in a case where the evidence is concerning but not definitive, where there is physical evidence of violence but no body has been found, where the timeline and the forensics suggest something serious occurred but the full picture is not yet clear, maintaining hope for the family while investigators continue their work is often the most humane approach. So investigators walked a line, a careful, deliberate, strategic line between the evidence and the hope, between what the scene showed and what the family needed to believe, between the forensic reality of blood and cameras and 41 minutes and the public narrative of kidnapping and ransom and the possibility of safe return. They processed the evidence with the seriousness and the expertise that a potential homicide requires. They brought in the specialists. They documented everything. They ran the forensic tests. They built the timeline. They pursued every lead. They treated Nancy's home as what the evidence suggested it was, which was the scene of a violent crime. But publicly, they maintained language that left room for hope, that allowed the ransom narrative to exist, that supported the family's belief that Nancy might still be alive and that paying the demanded money might bring her home. They did this not because they believed the ransom notes were genuine, though they had to evaluate that possibility, and not because they thought the evidence supported a scenario where Nancy was being held safely somewhere, though they could not completely rule that out. They did it because maintaining that narrative served investigative purposes, and because it was the most compassionate approach to a family living through unimaginable uncertainty. The 41-minute window between 1:47 and 2:28 on the morning of February 1st is where everything that matters happened, where the cameras went dark systematically, where someone moved through Nancy's property with clear purpose and planning, where something occurred that left physical evidence requiring homicide expertise to analyze, where the trajectory of this entire investigation was set in a direction that, despite the ransom notes, despite the public narrative, despite the hope of a family desperate to believe their loved one could be saved, was never really about a kidnapping for financial gain. It was about something that happened in a house in the Catalina foothills. Something that happened in the deep middle of the night. Something that left blood and took cameras and severed connections and removed a woman from her home in a condition that the evidence suggests was not consistent with her being taken to be held for ransom. Something that investigators recognized immediately for what it was when they processed that scene on the afternoon of February 1st. Something that required homicide investigators and FBI specialists and crime scene processing and a level of forensic analysis that is applied when the worst is suspected, even if it cannot yet be confirmed. Nancy Guthrie is a real person. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice. Her family deserves answers that are grounded in evidence rather than in hope that may not be supported by reality. And the investigation to provide those answers is ongoing, driven by forensics, by timeline reconstruction, by the careful analysis of everything that happened in those 41 minutes when the world believed a kidnapping was occurring, but when the evidence at the scene was telling investigators a very different and much darker story. If you have information that could be relevant to this case, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI immediately. If you want to follow this investigation as it develops with the kind of serious, evidence-based analysis that cuts through narratives to examine what the forensics actually show, subscribe to True Crime Vault and hit that notification bell. And if this analysis changed how you understood this case, if it made you think differently about the gap between public narrative and investigative reality, hit that like button and share this with anyone who has been following this story. The 41-minute window between 1:47 and 2:28 on the morning of February 1st is where everything that matters happened, where the cameras went dark systematically, where someone moved through Nancy's property with clear purpose and planning, where something occurred that left physical evidence requiring homicide expertise to analyze, where the trajectory of this entire investigation was set in a direction that, despite the ransom notes, despite the public narrative, despite the hope of a family desperate to believe their loved one could be saved, was never really about a kidnapping for financial gain. It was about something that happened in a house in the Catalina foothills, something that happened in the deep middle of the night, something that left blood and took cameras and severed connections, and removed a woman from her home in a condition that the evidence suggests was not consistent with her being taken to be held for ransom. Something that investigators recognized immediately for what it was when they processed that scene on the afternoon of February 1st. Something that required homicide investigators and FBI specialists and crime scene processing and a level of forensic analysis that is applied when the worst is suspected, even if it cannot yet be confirmed. Nancy Guthrie is a real person. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice. Her family deserves answers that are grounded in evidence rather than in hope that may not be supported by reality. And the investigation to provide those answers is ongoing, driven by forensics, by timeline reconstruction, by the careful analysis of everything that happened in those 41 minutes when the world believed a kidnapping was occurring, but when the evidence at the scene was telling investigators a very different and much darker story. If you have information that could be relevant to this case, contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI immediately. If you want to follow this investigation as it develops with the kind of serious, evidence-based analysis that cuts through narratives to examine what the forensics actually show, subscribe to True Crime Vault and hit that notification bell. And if this analysis changed how you understood this case, if it made you think differently about the gap between public narrative and investigative reality, hit that like button and share this with anyone who has been following this story. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you make of the 41-minute window? Why do you think investigators chose to maintain the kidnapping narrative publicly while treating the scene as a potential homicide? How should families be told about evidence that suggests their loved one may not have survived? These are hard questions without easy answers, and this community is a place where we can discuss them thoughtfully and seriously. Nancy Guthrie deserves the truth. Her family deserves answers, and we will be here covering every development as this investigation moves toward whatever resolution the evidence ultimately supports, no matter how difficult that truth may be to face.